Everybody needs companionship, right? And what better companion can there be than that of a Pokemon partner? Y'all seem to really enjoy the last video with the main cast, so for this go-around, I've gathered all our lovely TWST event characters and a couple special guests to determine who their perfect Pokemon partners would be. My picks will be entirely based off aesthetics, vibes, and a sprinkle of Pokedex entries. However, some of our special guests and my anecdotal evidence for their picks will include discussions of EN server story content, so this is your spoiler warning. We'll be starting off with the Chapter 7 story, folks, so if you do not want to view them, skip ahead to Chen'ya. But if you're all good, then Maleanor Draconia is where we will begin, and she will have a Hydreigon. Now, this Pokemon is not the most powerful of the dragon types. However, it has a Pokedex entry which makes it stand out to me and reminds me of Maleanor's predicament when we meet her in-game. According to the Violet Pokedex, this Pokemon grew ferocious because people in times long past loathed it, considering it to be evil incarnate and attacking it relentlessly. Does this perhaps remind you of anyone? Or a certain Twisted Wonderland character? It's mentioned when we meet Maleanor that she used to like humans, however, given how terrible they've been and continue to be to her and her people, how they're destroying their lands and claiming their resources, all while condemning the Fae who have lived there for millennia, one might be able to understand her anger towards them and the irritability that was on display during our interaction. I also feel like the three heads of Hydreigon can be emblematic of Maleanor's relationship with Lilia and Ravern, where those two were on her left and right respectively, while the main center head of Maleanor controls the shots. I think this is a Pokemon that she would have probably gotten from the humans potentially, as they may have abandoned it when they found out that dragons are weak to fairies, and because she could understand its predicament and foul mood, the two could bond over their shared experience and become good friends for as long as they had left. Now, Baur, for his part, would have a Tyranitar because I feel like these two aesthetically match, and the fact that they are a bit concerned with power and worthiness means they'd likely get along. Baur was immensely powerful in his prime and eventually takes over Lilia's position as General of the Right, so I think having a really strong Pokemon to back him up makes sense. Having the dark typing also kind of makes sense given the circumstances, but the ground typing could connect to Baur's homeland in the Sunset Savannah, giving it and him the duality that they deserve. Tyranitars can be destructive, so that doesn't quite fit Baur as well. However, their overall pride and strength does, so I can see the two getting along very well. I also think this Pokemon would have worked wonders during the war, since it may not have been something that the Silver Owls were anticipating. But I do think Tyranitar would have a really hard time standing against those mechs, because steel and all that. But regardless, I think these two would get along quite well and would fight side by side valiantly. Moving on to the Dawn Knight, I had a hard time picking a Pokemon since I think it would have to be light adjacent in some way. And Solrock is basically the sun, but it doesn't really fit the persona of the Dawn Knight. So after some consideration, I figured that Cinccino would be a good fit. It's cute, small, and could have easily been picked up by the Dawn Knight way before the war started as a Minccino. These Pokemon are meticulous about their appearance and are dust-free, which I think fits the squeaky queen white pearly vibe of the Dawn Knight. I do think this would make these Pokemon a nightmare to maintain during war. However, that may not actually be a problem for the Dawn Knight. I think him having a small fluffy friend makes sense since he is generically soft. In fact, he's a bit too soft and he really should have spoken up sooner about this whole war. But even then, I think I can parallel this Pokemon's fluffy fur to him, so while the pairing is unconventional and possibly even unrealistic, I do like to imagine the two together. Last but not least is Henrick, who I did not want to include, and I don't think anyone would have been upset if I didn't, but I also couldn't pass up an opportunity to drag him. Unfortunately for Snorlax, or maybe fortunately, given that Henrick hoards the spoils of war, these two are getting paired up. Snorlax is a very lazy and gluttonous Pokemon, which fits Henrick to a T. The only reason that this war is even going on is because Henrick is taking every single resource he can find for himself and his profits. Kinda similar to when Snorlax is, in the Legend of Arceus' Pokedex, devoured the entire food stock of villages, leaving nothing in their wake. Both of these fellows are rotund, lazy, and useless. Or well, Snorlax can be useful, but the same can't be said for Henrick. While Snorlax does have a few other redeeming qualities, Henrick does not, and I can't think of a more fitting Pokemon for this gluttonous greaseball than another gluttonous but not so greasy ball. Now, when it comes to Chen'ya, I think he would fit a variety of fun Pokemon, but rather than match his vibe, I decided to match his abilities instead. Chen'ya tends to pop up and disappear whenever he feels like it, similar to the Cheshire Cat from which he is twisted. We do not yet know, and may never know, the machinations of Chen'ya's invisibility, but we do know what we can see. Based off of this, I feel like Chen'ya would have a Zorao, which could eventually evolve into the much more illusionary Zorok. Zorao is a dark type, which is a bit strange for Chen'ya, but it is a Pokemon that can transform itself to blend in with its surroundings. This is a kind of invisibility that isn't exactly the same as Chen'ya's, but it is an invisibility nonetheless. Plus, when it eventually does evolve, it will be able to create much more elaborate illusions like a false invisibility or changing others' perspectives so that it cannot be perceived by them. Something along those lines would work well for Chen'ya and his little pranks. So I think that these two work together quite well in that mischievous way. Neige is up next, and I wanted to give him a Jigglypuff since he's a singer. However, I think Chansey actually fits him better. Chansey is a very caring and compassionate Pokemon that takes care of others as well as it takes care of its own egg. Since Neige was responsible for the dwarves growing up and essentially uses all of his profits to take care of them, I think this compassionate Pokemon suits him better. It's also said to deliver happiness, which I think fits Neige as well, since he seems to always be cheerful and happy whenever we meet him. Even in dire straits, he's still thinking of others, much like how Chansey shares its precious egg with those who are injured, even though it's dedicated a good part of its time to nurturing it. Because Neige is a kind, caretaking, beacon of sparkling sunshine character, I think that he and Chansey would get along super well and would help take care of each other as well as others. So, the RSA Dwarves. We don't really get to see too much of their personalities, so for these 7 characters, I'm gonna do a lightning round, where I give each of them a partner exclusively off of vibes without any sort of backing at all, because if I tried to do that, I think we would be here for a very long time indeed. So sorry to any dwarf lovers out there, but we got a lot of other folks to cover, so get ready, get set, it's gauntlet time. Starting off with Dominic, I am going to be giving him a Tranquil, because Dominic is the leader of the group and is very level-headed, and Tranquils are a, well, very tranquil Pokemon that I think matches this energy and his general vibe. Next up is Grumpy Grum with his Sylveon, because Grum is a very spicy and angry individual who I can see getting along super well with this spicy pepper Pokemon. The two have very similar attitudes and are rather confrontational, so I think they make a great pair. We've also got Shelpy, who's very sleepy, so I'm going to give him a Komala, since this Pokemon is also very sleepy. In fact, I'm not sure this Pokemon ever wakes up at all, given its dex entries, which I think makes it perfect for this very sleepy boy. Alrighty, Hop's got a Plusle to match their vibrant energy and hair clips. They do seem to be a bit positive all the time, no matter what, and since Plusle is quite literally positive and kind of matches the color of these hair clips, I think the two of them would have a wonderful time together. The shy Timmy is getting the shy Sobble because I feel like they'd both burst into tears from being overwhelmed if cornered by an extrovert. In the dwarf group, Timmy seems to do well enough, but I can totally see him getting embarrassed while Sobble hides behind him, and they're both blue, so they got that going for them too. Mr. Snick Snack himself is gonna get a Darumaka because Snick is always sneezy and seems rather cold and sickly with his scarf up over his mouth. So I think having a fire type to keep him warm might help. At least he can keep the chills at bay with this little guy. And last but not least is Toby, who is honestly pretty forgetful, so I'm gonna give him a Slowpoke since I feel like these Pokemon also embody that same energy. Slowpokes are also a little bit dopey, or so the Pokédex entries say, which I feel like is just yet another coincidence. So to finish off RSA, we're going to head over to their head mage, Ambrose the 63rd, and I think he would have a Stoutland. They both have beautiful facial hair, both seem warm and approachable, and Stoutland is a wise and gentle Pokemon that parents apparently trust to babysit their kid. This combined with it also being intelligent, good-natured, and valiant make me feel very secure, and Ambrose also gives off that vibe. He seems very concerned about the welfare of students, even those that are not his own, because I do feel like he was absolutely the nail in the coffin for Crowley getting called into court. And I don't think he was being malicious in the slightest in that. Sure, he digs a little deep at the Birdman during their conversation, but I don't really view that interaction as anything malicious, and RSA's whole point is to be nice. They're meant to be good. While they can come across in a sickeningly sweet way, there is no way that Ambrose had any true ill intent towards NRC, maybe outside of friendly rivalry. Given that, I feel like Stoutland is the perfect warm and fuzzy and completely responsible adult-type Pokemon that fits this man, and also is the perfect counterbalance thematically to Crowley as a character. Since Stoutlands enjoy the company of people and warm up easily, I can see it being as friendly as the RSA students too, making it truly perfect for Ambrose the 63rd, at least to me. Now the Ramshackle Ghosts should have some buddies too, right? And I think they would have a Shuppet, Duskull, and Misdreavus respectively. I don't think they've really trained these Pokemon to the point of being super strong or intimidating or evolving, but I don't think that makes them any less spooky to the unsuspecting guests of Ramshackle. Each of these Pokemon have very interesting dex entries which could relate in some way to the general vibe of NRC's prideful student body, which would make them happy to stick around even if they aren't on the main part of campus, I suppose. But I think it's fitting for the ghosts, who have been ghosts for almost as long as they can remember, to have some ghost buddies as well. Moving on, we have, Eliza. Dear Eliza, what are we gonna do with you? We are going to give her a Frostlass because ghosts are quite cold and Frostlass freezes their prey and displays them, or so it is said. Do you know who also kind of froze their prey and put them on display for everyone else to see? Also, while this Pokemon generally preys on men, it specifically hunts men that it thinks are handsome. Kinda like a certain other someone we know. I think the parallels are a bit too strong here for Eliza to have any other kind of Pokemon, because at the end of the day, Eliza was really only going to marry Edea to have him as arm candy, and Frostlass really only freezes things to have them as decorations. There was no thought put into Edea's or anyone else's emotions during this whole process, which is so similar to Frostlass just unaliving and keeping people in Pokemon it thinks are cute in its den. And technically the wedding was going to end with Edea not only frozen, but also ended, so these two ladies are an absolutely perfect match. Now Puffy, Eliza's eventual actual boo, is going to have a Golurk. This is a Pokemon that was created to protect people and Pokemon, which I think fits Puffy's role as Eliza's guard. Puffy's desire for Eliza to be happy and to protect her until that day is what turned him into a ghost. So I think he'd get along well with a Pokemon whose sole purpose is rather similar. Golurks run off a mysterious energy which could be similar to the strong desires that ghosts generically are said to have in order for them to exist. This Pokemon can also rampage if its seal is removed, which results in a large amount of power being indiscriminately used on anyone or anything. I think this is also somewhat similar to Puffy's big outburst at the end of that event, where he gets really big and starts going after all of those pesky wedding interlopers. So while these two don't have a strong connection like Eliza and Frostlass, I think there's enough there to make them a good pair. The Fairy Queen was really hard to pick for because there are so many fairy Pokemon and not much information on the character of the Fairy Queen. The most we get is out of the second Fairy Gala, and that's still not that much, so I think she's extremely open to interpretation. I ended up picking a Pokemon that I don't think is her expressive partner per se, but one that works in tandem with her subsect of Fae in their springtime pursuits. So Xerneas is going to be the Fairy Queen's business partner in this consideration. This Pokemon is known to bring life to forests and is said to even be able to share eternal life with others. Given that the Fae live for long stretches of time, one could consider them immortal beings, And since the Fairy Gala is an entire event dedicated to bringing spring, I feel like that also kind of parallels the power of this Pokemon. Crowley also mentions at one point that if the Fairy Gala is interrupted, then spring won't come at all. An endless winter doesn't really sound like life, it sounds like destruction, which is Yveltal's territory. So where spring, the gala, and the queen are concerned, this seems to be the most fitting of the fairy types, at least to me. Since it's a legendary, I don't think it belongs to the queen specifically, but it absolutely can be emblematic of her and her people, and it might even work with them in this alternate universe to ensure that the whole world receives its spring. Now for Najma, I feel like she'd have to have a bright and fun Pokemon, but also one that could survive in the desert without too much trouble. So I think that she'd be besties with her family's Phanpy, since the two just have that bright, sunny vibe. Phanpy doesn't know its own strength, but it is super strong, so I can see this being a Pokemon Jamil's family uses to help with their work for the Essenes. Since it can handle people riding it, perhaps it can help carry supplies from place to place or reorganize the storehouses or similar tasks. Since it's still a youngster, it is a bit smaller and would be able to walk through the halls more easily. It could also be a loner Pokemon from the Essenes that attached itself to Najma, so it listens to her better than anyone else, and basically then became her partner. The two might get into trouble every now and again, but I think they'd have a good time hanging out and helping out wherever they could. Phanpy might not be the most practical of Pokemon, but I do think it's cute and it has an energy that reminds me of Najma, so that's who I'm gonna pair up with her. Now then, Marja was a firecracker in her youth, and I think she would have been the type to probably have a full team of Pokemon. We know she's a good leader since her sled team was top rank consistently, and I think she'd have the moxie to be challenging folks left and right, maybe even at some point being a gym leader. However, we don't get very much information about her youth outside of sledding, so that's just my personal headcanon for this particular AU. I think nowadays, given how family-oriented she seems to be, and how the whole of Harveston is centered around farming apples, I think it makes sense for this lovely granny to have an Appleton. This is probably the least cool evolution of Applin, but it is the most granny, because when I think of grandma, I think of sweets and baking and the wholesome warm goodness, all of which is encapsulated in this Pokemon's design. The Pokemon itself is in part edible, and I think Harveston might have a slightly morbid contest to decide whose Appleton tastes the best, assuming the skin can be harvested without, ending the Pokemon. And I think that sort of contest might be right up Marja's alley. Appleton's also big into eating bug Pokemon, so having one around the orchard, controlling the pests while also giving you some nectar seems like a win-win to me. Perhaps that's why Marja evolved her Applin into an Appleton to begin with, to help out on the farm, and now it has the added benefit of being a delightfully sweet Pokemon partner. Next up, we have Dylla Spade, and there were quite a few comments in the last video around how Deuce could have possibly had a Togepi since Dylla works for the delivery service, and that same service in the Pokemon universe also tends to give folks the mystery egg which eventually hatches into the Togepi. I do hear you, however, I raise that the Togepi, or in this case the Togetic, is actually Dylla's Pokemon partner. I think Dylla could have gotten this egg during her early days on the job, and therefore Deuce may not have been old enough or in existence to take care of the egg, let alone the Togepi once it hatched. Since the later evolutions also have flying or hovering, I think they would be especially useful during deliveries, and Togetic specifically also has hands to hold boxes while floating, which is very fancy, very useful. This Pokemon is also centered around kind-heartedness and positive vibes, which I think has a place within Deuce, but it does not have a place at NRC. The campus is not conducive to the growth of this Pokemon in the slightest, and I think even if it was with its trainer, it may not have a great time or grow as well as it could have at, say, RSA. Dylla, on the other hand, lives in a town that does have a delinquent problem, but on the whole, it seems like a lovely place with many good people in it. I also really feel like Dylla cares about her community and the people in it, so I can see the Togepi and later Togetic recognizing that and sticking around with her. Plus, Dylla put her all into raising Deuce despite the difficulties of being a single mother, which I think makes her very kind-hearted and a giving person that this Pokemon would also love. Even though Deuce hung around some interesting crowds, I don't think that this Togetic would have completely abandoned him, since at the end of the day, at his core, Deuce is a good being. Therefore, I think that Dylla would have also taken Togetic's continued involvement, to whatever degree, with Deuce as a sign that he was not completely lost to delinquency. Togetic would then have played a pivotal role in patching Deuce and Dia's relationship and could also have been a large contributing factor to Dylla's continued faith in him during their struggles. Those are my reasons, for my list anyways. I just think Togetic fits Dia and her delivery job much better, so I'm pairing them together. Next up is Kifaji, Royal Chamberlain and Bird Beastman. I feel like given his bird nature, he has to have a flying type, or at least a bird-esque Pokemon, so after looking through the list, I settled on one that I completely forgot existed, Chatot. This Pokemon is very chatty, as the name suggests, and can mimic human speech as well as Pokemon calls. I think for Kifaji's job as Chamberlain, this could be exceptionally helpful in recalling parts of conversations he had, keeping track of details, and intimidating those he's meeting with to remain on their best behavior. You can't really have a secret dealing around this Pokemon since it can perfectly mimic you, so I think you'd have to be very careful about what you'd say given who it could be repeated to. This, I think, also acts as a form of accountability for Kifaji since he too would be bound by this limitation, and I think that could make him more trustworthy to the royal family. I also think that Kifaji having this Chatot would be a huge contributing factor to him not having heard any rumors about Leona, assuming that this is indeed the case, because I personally think if he had, he would have put a stop to them. I can't imagine any of the palace workers talking smack with Chatot around, and for some reason these two just give off the same aura to me. I can't really explain it, but these two are gonna get paired up together. Now Cheka, this adorable little guy, I also didn't want to give a lion because I figured that'd be too on the nose, similar to Leona. But I do think it would make sense for the royal family of the Sunset Savannah to have a good relationship with a pride of Pyroars. They may have a tradition where their firstborns in the line of succession bond to a Litleo from the pride and the two grow up together in some sort of symbolic way. I could see that being a thing. And I think this could totally connect the royal family back to nature in a way that feels somewhat justifiable, given how much emphasis is placed on tradition and balance. At least, that was my thinking. So in this case, Cheka would likely be getting a Litleo. However, I can also see Cheka being a special little snowflake that has two Pokemon instead, a Patrat and a Lechonk. Cheka has a habit of sneaking off to go visit his uncle or make him mischief somewhere, so I think his family would have given him a Patrat to circumvent some of this danger. The Lechonk is here just to make the pair, as there isn't, to my knowledge, a Warthog Pokemon, but Lechonks do have an herbal smell which repels bugs. It's not as effective as a full repel, but it at least limits the number of encounters Cheka might have to face with other Pokemon when he wanders off and away from his guards, who would be much more well equipped for those sorts of encounters. Plus, the Timon Pumbaa angle is very intentional on my part for this little guy, so those are the Pokemon that I'm going to give him. Now, Gantu is, I think, a shark alien, or at least shark-based, so a water type would fit him best. A Sharpedo is the obvious choice given their natures, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that he actually has a Golisopod. Gantu may be persistent, but he's not really a bully, at least not in the Stitch event, which is what I'm going to be basing my consideration off of rather than the movie. To me, he comes off as an exasperated adult who is here to do his job and is being thwarted by a bunch of kids who don't understand the danger they're in, at least from his perspective. Therefore, I think the more meditative but persistent Golisopod matches this version of Gantu better since it's a bit more level-headed in the Pokédex entries while still doing whatever it can to win. This parallels Gantu's eventual kidnapping of Grim as his last resort effort to get Stitch into his possession, as he's driven to these desperate measures as a result of our group's interference. It's also a very sturdy Pokemon, which I think matches Gantu too, so the fine fellows are going to be buddies here. So Stitch. Stitch is basically a Pokemon, and if he was, I think he'd be a Fairy Steel type, but if I had to convert him into a pre-existing Pokemon, I think he'd be a Grimmsnarl, which is not Fairy Steel, but it is a Gremlin, and a Gremlin becoming another Gremlin just makes sense to me. This Pokemon is incredibly strong and can bolster its strength with the use of its hair. Stitch is naturally incredibly strong and is also very fluffy, so it would seem anyway. Even though Stitch has reformed and is now a productive member of Lilo's family, he's still got a bit of a mischievous side. In Stitch's tropical turbulence, Stitch is essentially an imp-ish little guy who partakes in various pranks on various individuals. Given Grimmsnarl and its previous forms' penchant for pranks, I think these two tricksters fit together very well. So, Stitch would be paired with, a Grimmsnarl. Now then, Ernesto was a bit difficult to puzzle out because I could just give him a Thievul, because sneaky foxes be sneaky, but I feel like Ernesto would get sussed out so easily by having a literal thief fox, so I went looking for a less obvious but perhaps more showy Pokemon. Perhaps a Pokemon that gets overlooked but is actually pretty strong in some way, or a Pokemon that would make sense for him to have in the context of Playful Land. There are several circus-themed Pokemon that could work from that angle, some of them less perceivably strong, but in the end I decided to go with a Mr. Rhyme. I feel like at some point in Ernesto's life, he thought about running away with the circus, and during that consideration, he ended up obtaining or finding a Mime Jr. How it then evolved into a Mr. Rhyme and not a Mr. Mime, I'll leave up to your imagination, but I think the aesthetic of this Pokemon matches the persona of Ernesto that's on display when we meet him. Plus, it's got great utility for Ernesto's lifestyle. This Pokemon is known for its tap dancing, which I'm sure Ernesto made use of in the past to get some extra coinage or provide a good distraction for other misdeeds. Mr. Rhyme is also, by all appearances, not intimidating at all, which lends itself well to the playful pair's MO. I think given the generic popularity of Mr. Mimes with the youths of the Pokemon universe, this could also lower the defenses of unsuspecting parkgoers who were eventually then frozen, so to speak, as a puppet, which is a tenuous connection to the ice typing, but it is a connection nonetheless. The psychic typing meshes generically with Ernesto's special magic too, so I can see these two working together very well in their endeavors. With Gino, though, it was no contest. Gino absolutely has a Tinkaton. Look at these two hammer buddies, they just vibe so well, and their color palettes match as well. Perhaps Gino would not have a fully evolved Pokemon, but I do feel like given the trauma he and Ernesto have supposedly experienced, they probably would have been in a lot of situations where fighting was necessary, and because of that, their Pokemon would likely have a lot of experience, so I'm comfortable giving him the most evolved form. Tinkatons are quite intelligent, and they also plunder whatever they can, which I think fits the generic lifestyle these two have been living up until this point. I do think that Gino is quite bright, he just hasn't been able to apply himself to the right context yet, so this pairing feels good in that realm. I also think the visual of cute little pink blob carrying giant hammer also lends itself well to Gino appearing very harmless with his toy-looking hammer, only for him and his hammer to actually be quite dangerous during the final act. These two just get it, and I appreciate that they get it, so they're getting paired up. I rest my case. Now then, Rollo. Rollo may be a fiery spirit, but he's actually really good at gardening. I mean, he'd have to be a pretty prolific plant dad to be able to resurrect a long extinct flower, so for this reason, I think he should have a grass type. And out of all of the grass types, I think there's only one choice that gives him enough depth. Sure, Go-Goat is a goat and Floor City is known to be respectful of these creatures, but they're a bit too cheery for Rollo, right? And to me, there's just so much wonderful symbolism in him having a superior that I had to go with the snake here. Rollo gives off a studious and honorable vibe at first glance, but there is an unresolved darkness in his soul that influences his actions and drives his motivations. Having a snake by his side would subtly allude to this struggle, given that there are Christian undertones in the context surrounding Rollo. I don't think this pairing would work as well if the symbolism wasn't already there for me to play with, even though this particular snake is well suited for Rollo regardless of its other implications. Superior, as the name suggests, feels very superior to those around it and only challenges those it deems worthy enough. The snakes are said to be noble and majestic, even being called Lord of the Forest in the Violet Pokedex. These Pokemon also glare a lot, which is something that Rollo also tends to do, so this is a match made in heaven. Or hell, I suppose. Symbolism and all that. And with that, those are our extra characters and their Pokemon partners. I hope y'all had fun again. This was quite an interesting list to pull together, but there are so many options and so many reasons for folks to have certain Pokemon, so please do tell me your thoughts down below. And if you liked this video and want more content like it, please let me know that with a like, or a comment, or maybe even a subscribe. And yes, I know there are 2 other people who are not mentioned because they have not yet come to EN server. However, they are very popular, so I will indulge you this once and let you know that I think one of them would have a Pumpkaboo and the other would have an Aromatisse, for reasons I cannot fully yet explain. So have fun with that knowledge. Now, before you go, I'd just like to remind you that you're amazing and I hope you have a wonderful day.